Hey everyone, this is Adam Calloway, the Director of Ministry with the Timothy Trust, and I am here with Dr. D.A. Carson, who is Emeritus Professor of New Testament at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois. He also is the co-founder and theologian at large with the Gospel Coalition and has written and edited a number of books, including Memoirs of an Ordinary Pastor, commentaries on the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John, and editor of the New Studies in Biblical Theology and many more besides, and is husband to Joy and father of 2 grown children. And Dr. Carson, it's so wonderful to have you join us for this little interview.
Oh, it's my privilege.
Thank you for giving us some of your time. I wondered, brother, if we could think a little bit about training for expository ministry. With your unique role as professor at Trinity for all those years, and you're traveling and training preachers. I wonder if you could share a little bit of your experience in training people for expository preaching.
A lot hangs on what you mean by training. A huge amount of what goes into the shaping of an expositor is example. And ideally, somewhat diverse example. If someone gloms onto one particular model and listens, reads everything that person has produced, then he is likely to come out a kind of robot, a kind of echo chamber. Whereas if you listen to Jim Packer and then listen to John Piper, then listen to John Stott, then listen to Jonathan Griffiths. All of them have very different styles. But what is common to them is their desire to explain what the text says, first and foremost in the categories that the text deploys. So if by training you mean anything that feeds into making an expositor, a lot of training is in the models that you choose. I've sometimes said to young preachers that if you listen to 50 sermons by one preacher, you become a clone. You listen to 20 sermons by 20 different preachers, and you will find your own voice. And so part of training is learning how to listen to a sermon. You want ordinary people to listen to a sermon in order to be fed. And preachers need to listen to sermons in order to be fed, but they also need to listen critically. I don't mean negatively, I mean discerningly, to see what has gone into the sermon, what has been left out, what's the shape of things, how the preacher moves from the text to the human context, how it fits into a biblical theology that is either articulated or unarticulated, and so on and so on and so on. So the first thing I'd say is the most important part of training is good examples. Then second, I would say that there is a primacy of place to be given to understanding text, to become a good reader. There are some students at seminary who do well in exegesis classes and can parse verbs and do line diagrams to show what clause belongs to what clause and so on. But everything is bitty. They still don't have a feel for the text. They're not good readers. So another thing that I would say is that somebody who wants to become an expositor of sacred scripture needs to do whatever is necessary to improve his reading skills. Read intelligently, read critically, read diverse literature, read new material, old material, and read at different speeds, read for different purposes. But a good preacher is always, without exception, a good reader. Might be a fast reader or a slow reader, as John Piper describes himself, but he's a reader. And failing that, you become a mechanical preacher rather than a gifted expository preacher. then with those two things in place, obviously good courses on homiletics help. But homiletics, again, can usefully be divided into two branches. One, how to handle the text, and two, how to apply it and make it sing and sting and wound and heal in the contemporary context. And they are interrelated, but they are not the same thing. So I've had the pleasure of listening to a lot of preachers from a lot of countries for a lot of decades now. And so inevitably, I have learned some things in the last 50 years that are not in a homiletics textbook. They're part of life. They're part of examples. They're part of friendship. And one of the things I have learned is not to try to imitate any one preacher, whether it's Lucas or Packer or Stott or Piper or anybody else, Dever, anybody who you care to name, but to learn from all of them, to listen humbly, be grateful that the Lord has made you what you are, and self-correct with time.
Well, that's a treasure trove of wisdom there. And you know, you've trained preachers in a lot of different countries and a lot of different places, so it's great to hear what comes to mind first there. And I wonder if you could dive into some of those areas that you've just laid out a little bit more. Namely, like what wisdom might you share to a young preacher or somebody who's been trying it out or maybe doing it for a while, and would like to train more or get some more tools for expository preaching? How would you counsel them to think about things like further theological education?
Theological education should not be simply something pursued with how-to desires in mind. In other words, theological education is taken on board so as to learn the text better, to know God better, to think through how to live. Now, as a subpoint of that, then of course, you want to learn to improve your skills, which include not only good reading and that sort of thing that I've just said, hermeneutics, but also delivery and the expressions you use, and even things like how long a sermon is, and different literary genres, and level of discourse, and on and on and on and on and on. All those things can be learned. And obviously, if a student has the opportunity to do this in a really good seminary, that's ideal. You can learn so much more quickly in a really good seminary with a good preaching program. So you don't go to a seminary just because it's got a renowned expositor as head of the homiletics department, because a good seminary will also be teaching you exegesis and Greek and Hebrew and church history and systematic theology and biblical theology and so on. And all of those things ideally should get integrated into the preaching program. What you don't want is a seminary with, let's say, a really excellent biblical theology program, and then a homiletics department that is entirely abstracted from biblical theology. Ideally, you want a program where the parts fit together and mutually reinforce one another. That's ideal. Now, granted that not everybody can do that, then personal mentoring, personal reading, personal study, and programs that are cropping up around Canada, around the US, around Great Britain, in many parts of the world, in Australia, in Malaysia, and so on. There are programs to help preachers where there are combinations of lectures given by gifted expositors on some particular topic or other, then practice sermons where you are enjoying, put that in quotation marks, enjoying critique from fellow preachers. It's a little daunting at first to submit your work to other preachers, but if everybody's doing it in a private setting, then it is some of the best criticism you can get, and builds self-criticism on the long haul, which is one of the ingredients that is necessary for all improvement.
Well, that's really helpful, and I think I can speak from experience here with Dr. Griffiths, who's the founder of the Timothy Trust. We've had some good laughs over some of the things that I've chosen to do in some of my sermons, and that usually follows with a maybe you don't want to try that again. And that can be good and helpful and memorable. Along those lines, Dr. Carson, I wonder what wisdom you might share to preachers trying to grow in their expository preaching. And maybe while they're going through seminary or getting some more theological education or doing some of this reading, how they might take advantage of training for preaching in the context of the local church.
I'm not quite sure what you're asking. Are you asking how can you take advantage of programs that are already there, or how a local church can start doing something that it hasn't been doing?
I think I'm speaking more from the perspective of the individual who may want to pursue opportunities to learn to preach within the church, or how would you counsel them to go about that?
Well, again, a lot depends on the situation. If you're talking about a young preacher who's an assistant pastor in a church staff with 5 people, then he should be in close conversation with the senior minister, those that are responsible for training, as to where he can exercise his gifts and enjoy some critique and so on. But obviously he can't just do that on his own. He's part of a team, and there are senior people over him that are part of the team as well. What I would say is that criticism, mutual criticism, is a godly thing. One doesn't have to read far in Proverbs before finding things like that out. And that means that you want a situation where senior people are not only good models, but are offering critique. I know some situations that shall remain blessedly nameless, where there's a gifted senior pastor and a promising younger assistant at some level or other, but the senior man never listens to and offers criticism, constructive criticism of the junior man. That's a mistake. That's robbing the junior man. It's good to have a model, but you don't do the best with the potential that a model can give you unless there is overt, constructive, loving, firm, wise, insightful, consistent criticism. And so you want a situation in a local church, which was your question, where there's enough commitment to expository preaching that somebody senior is listening to the junior members just about every time they open their mouths. So that there is promise of corporate self-criticism, leadership self-criticism, and so on. And ideally, the kind of relationship in which the senior man himself is not above criticism. The senior and the junior are not offering criticism at the same level or with the same authority or with the same structure and so on. And yet one of the things that ought to be modeled by the senior person is a certain kind of teachability, a certain kind of winsomeness, a certain kind of desire for improvement. And if the junior one asks, I don't mean to be rude, but what did you do that for? Did you get that one quite right? Then it may be that he will actually improve the senior, or it might be that he's got the wrong end of the stick and he'll back off and apologize and say, whoops, I got that one wrong. In any case, you were right after all, and so on. And so the dynamics of a good team, of a good set of relationships, of making the most of every opportunity with mutual criticism and constructive, loving instruction is a pearl without price.
Oh, that's great. And I can remember there was a pastor that I used to serve under a while back, and you also know him, but I think maybe we should leave him blessedly nameless as well. But he actually had a weekly meeting where he would share his sermon manuscript for the upcoming Sunday with a number of congregants that were diverse in age and gender and nationality and these kinds of things. And he would read what he had up to that point prepared, and he would open up to feedback and what was helpful, what struck you, what confused you, and what could have been clearer, and these kinds of things. And I remember that, and I took that with me here, and I've employed my own kind of thing in my preaching with some congregants as well, and I find that to be helpful and vulnerable, and helps you grow and think from multiple perspectives. And finally, Dr. Carson, I wonder if you could share some wisdom. You tapped into good reading earlier. How might preachers look to train for expository preaching through books and other resources? What recommendations or tips for growth might you offer them?
Well, there are two classes of reading that help you in expository preaching. One has to do with understanding the text better. So that means reading the Bible, reading commentaries, reading biblical theology. If you're going to start a series on Hebrews, make sure that you read not only 3 or 4 commentaries on Hebrews before you start, but also some books on the theology of Hebrews and the use of the Old Testament in Hebrews and covenant themes and so on, so that you become familiar with things. So there's reading along those lines. There's no rule of thumb how much you read, how well you read, how fast you read, the level at which you read, and so on. Really are idiosyncratic. They're highly dependent on who you are and what you've already studied and what you've already learned. But then there is another set of readings that are worth it, readings about preaching. And there are certain standard works by Stott, for example, that everyone has come across, focusing on 2 horizons, the horizon of the text and the horizon of your own location. And so on the one hand, you're reading textual material, and on the other hand, you're reading explanations about how you go about doing it. These books are pitched at different levels. So there are a couple of fairly elementary books that are nevertheless quite profound by Greg Scharf, for example, that are really quite good and not too long. There are some books on preaching that go on and on forever, but what you get out of them, there's a law of diminishing returns after a while. Books like those by Greg are succinct, yet sensible, and open up new horizons. There are books that deal with how to handle different literary genres, whether it's narrative or parable or apocalyptic literature or discourse material, letters, epistles, and so on. And so there are lots of books along those lines that are more specialist in some respects, but are part of what goes into self-critical training. There are some preachers, again, who shall remain blessedly nameless, who preach for 40 years, and only in the rarest of occasions have they got out of the New Testament. And only in the rarest of occasions have they preached anything other than discourse material. So they've never really learned to preach narrative. They've handled Romans and Ephesians and Galatians and pastoral epistles and so on repeatedly, but they've never actually preached through John, Matthew, let alone 2 Samuel, Isaiah.